Chapter 10, Interest Groups. In this chapter, we're going to learn the following objectives. We will consider the role that interest groups play in American politics, and we will first study several theories of interest group politics and analyze what makes interest groups successful. Then we'll look at how interest groups shape public policy. Next, we'll identify various types of interest groups, and finally, we will contemplate why there's been no progress in controlling the influence of interest groups. Interest groups are organized to pursue policy goals. For example, the goal of some interest groups is to outlaw abortion, and the goal of others is to assure access to abortion. Political parties may also have policy goals that they pursue, but parties exist to mainly run candidates for office. Interest groups may support candidates, but they don't run their own slate of candidates for elective offices. Also, interest groups tend to specialize in one policy area, where major political parties must be policy generalists and know a little bit about lots of different areas. There are more than 25,000 interest groups in the United States, representing just about everything you can imagine. Developments in electronic communications have made it easier for interest groups to reach both their policymakers and the public. There are theories of interest group politics, and the question is, do interest groups help or hinder government in America? And when you look at the three different theories, they each take a different view of the benefits or the harm of interest groups. First group is pluralism, and pluralists have a positive view of interest groups. Since lobbying is open to all groups, groups can compete with one another, and no group wins or loses all the time. According to the pluralist perspective, interest groups are useful for democracy because they allow people to be connected or to link to their government. If you can get your interest organized, it'll receive a hearing by government. Groups make competing claims on government, balancing each other and preventing any one interest from dominating. Most groups play by the rules to keep the competition fair, and groups can each use their own advantages. Big business, for example, may have more money, but labor has more people. This isn't to say that some groups aren't stronger than others, nor to claim that all interest groups get an equal hearing, but lobbying is ultimately open to all. And lobbying, is when you can go and meet with congressmen and make those relationships. And since lobbying is open to all, it prevents interest groups from being a problem in our system. In contrast to the pluralists, who see many groups competing on a relatively equal footing, elitists observe that these groups are vastly unequal in their power and influence. Elitism is the dominant view of interest group politics today. Elitists have observed that certain people tend to hold more than one institutional leadership position, creating interlocking directorates, and the interests of multinational corporations prevail over consumer interests, so interests that represent the people. Interest groups are detrimental in this view because the interests of the wealthy few benefit at the expense of everyone else. Hyperpluralism. Like pluralists, hyperpluralists see many groups competing on a relatively equal footing for government attention. But unlike pluralists, hyperpluralists don't see good governance as the result. Because government seeks to appease all interests, policies proliferate. So there's just a lot of policies. Budgets increase and more programs and regulations are created. In some cases, interest groups develop a tight ongoing relationship with the federal agency that oversees policy related to their interests, and the congressional committee in charge of handling the relevant policy. These networks are known as iron triangles, and I would pay attention. So iron triangles deal with the interest group, the congressional committee in charge of that policy, okay? And the federal agency. So these networks, iron triangles, which almost always comes up on the AP exam, can lead to the control of the regulators by the regulated. Basically, hyperpluralists see the selfish competition of groups for the proliferation of policies that narrowly benefit their interests as leading to contradictory and confusing policy results. So if everybody is pushing for a policy and everybody's getting a policy, then these things are conflicting with each other and just causes confusion. Why are some interest groups more successful than others? The size, intensity, and financial resources of an interest group all contribute to the likelihood of an interest group achieving its goals and being successful. Small groups have an advantage in interest group politics because it's easier for them to organize. That is, to turn potential members into actual members. A potential group is composed of all the people who might be group members because they share some common interest, whereas an actual group is composed of those in the potential group who choose to join. Groups vary enormously in the degree to which they enroll their potential membership. A small number of producer companies can organize more effectively than large numbers of consumers. When a group secures benefits for its members, those in the potential member category also reap those benefits. For example, if a labor group fights for a higher minimum wage, non-members will receive that higher wage too. Benefits like clean air, which cannot be withheld from non-members, are known as collective goods. It's perfectly rational for people to sit back and let others do the work when the benefits are in the form of collective goods. This is called the free rider problem, and it's more of a problem for larger groups than smaller ones. Large groups deal with this by offering selective benefits, like some sort of reward for joining the group that's unavailable to non-members. A good example of this is the AARP, which is the association to deal with retired persons, so the elderly. And so with this group, they have a lot of potential members, right? Everyone over a certain age is a potential member. The actual members are the people that actually join the groups. That's the actual group. The problem is they have a big free rider problem in that if the AARP lobbies for, say, Social Security benefits, Medicare, things like that, and wins some policy objectives, all the potential members, all the elderly people benefit from that, whether or not they're a member of the AARP. So the AARP, in order to deal with this free rider problem, they have some selective benefits for people that join AARP for their actual group. And those selective benefits are things like reduced insurance rates, special travel rates, things like that. The intensity of support for or opposition to a policy has an impact on its likelihood of passage. Single-issue groups which lobby passionately for a narrow interest are on the rise. These groups dislike compromise and develop sophisticated strategies for enacting policies that lead to their goals. And a prime example of this is abortion. It has many single-issue groups on both the pro-life and pro-choice side. The interest group system is biased towards the wealthy mainly because of the cost of political campaigns. Campaign contributions by interest groups buy access to politicians that the groups expect to lead to favorable policy outcomes. But campaign contributions don't always lead to lobbying success. Remember that lobbying is competitive and the other side is also making contributions. So pro-life organizations may be contributing money to campaigns, and so are pro-choice organizations. Interest groups use four main strategies to achieve their policy goals: lobbying, electioneering, litigation, and going public. Groups vary in which strategies dominate, but most use multiple tactics in pursuit of their policy goals. Interest groups employ lobbyists to haunt the halls of the Capitol and to get in close with legislators and officials. Well-funded interest groups can afford to have full-time lobbyists on staff. Groups that are too small to afford a full-time lobbyist hire temporary ones when critical policies are being debated. Lobbyists are often former legislators, and why would that be? Because if they're former legislators, they have all the relationships and with the current legislators, so those people are more likely to get in the door. Why do members of Congress give lobbyists their time and attention? Well, lobbyists are important sources of information. They're almost like research consultants. Congressmen must be policy generalists, but lobbyists can be experts in a specific policy area and provide information on the effects of various policy options. So lobbyists are also politically savvy and can serve as consultants. They can offer advice on how to get a policy through Congress or how to win votes of a certain constituency. So they often will advise members of Congress on if they have a policy they want to pass that's in the interest group's policy agenda. The interest group will actually help that congressman or woman shape the bill so that it's more likely to pass. Members of Congress are always eager to claim credit, and lobbyists can give them ideas for bills to introduce. So this graph presents the total amount spent on lobbying by industries that were the biggest spenders for the first 3 years of the Obama presidency. You need to keep in mind that the data are presented in terms of millions of dollars spent. Thus, the pharmaceutical industry spent an enormous amount of money. Think about that, in millions on lobbying. All told, just these 15 industries spent about $5 billion on lobbying during these 3 years. Another big interest group is the NRA. For years, the National Rifle Association has successfully lobbied against gun control measures, arguing that the Second Amendment to the Constitution guarantees all citizens the right to bear arms. Here, a shooting instructor fires a high-power pellet rifle in the indoor range at the 2012 annual meeting of the NRA, which was attended by more than 70,000 members. Interest groups don't want to waste their time lobbying officials known to be opposed to their position, so they try to get sympathetic candidates elected. Electioneering is the strategy of aiding candidates financially and getting group members to support them. In order to legally funnel donations to candidates, interest groups form political action committees or PACs. PACs can give $5,000 per candidate in the primary and general election campaigns. PACs overwhelmingly support incumbents. Do you know why? It's because incumbents almost always win. These are people that already hold office. Some people think that PAC money makes candidates beholden to wealthy interest groups, and this is a big complaint about Hillary Clinton with some of her donations, that she is tied to a lot of interest groups. Today, many candidates receive the majority of their campaign money from PACs. Lawsuits are another strategy employed by interest groups. If they fail in Congress or the White House, they can appeal to the courts to rule in their favor. Environmental groups have had some success suing for enforcement of environmental legislation. In the 1950s, when civil rights groups had failed to make headway with Congress, they sued to invalidate discriminatory laws on constitutional grounds. Even when a group is not directly involved in litigation, they can weigh in with their opinion on how the court should rule, and they do this by filing what they call an amicus curiae brief. This means friend of the court. So even though they're not a party to the case, they can offer their own legal opinion to support one side or the other. Hundreds of these friends of the court briefs are filed in cases with many interest groups on both sides of the issue. Because interest groups frequently represent the interests of large numbers of people affected by a policy, they can also file class action lawsuits to combine their grievances into one single lawsuit. So everyone affected by, say, asbestos, which can cause a type of cancer, they can all file one giant lawsuit instead of going through the process of filing individual lawsuits. That can be done for interest groups. Interest groups appeal to politicians to support their policy stance, but they also appeal to the public because officials respond to public opinion to a certain extent. Interest groups can mobilize public opinion by urging supporters to send postcards or emails to legislatures or sign petitions that demonstrate the extent of support or opposition to a policy. Business interest groups engage in public relations efforts to defend their reputations and promote their stance on issues. The fossil fuel industry spends a tremendous amount of money trying to remold its reputation in the public eye with vigorous PR campaigns in the national media. And this PR advertising seems to pay off for big business. So after the BP oil spill, you'll see a lot of advertising that BP has done and the fossil fuel industry has done to promote how safe they're being now with their oil production. Another thing to talk about is if you'll see some ads and they'll say at the end of a political ad, it won't be for a certain candidate, but it'll say like, call Congress and tell your congressman that you're concerned about the national debt or you're concerned about environmental policy or whatever it is. That's what they're talking about here. That's a way to try to appeal to the public to get involved. And so here is an example of an interest group ad that ran. Interest groups spent over $100 million appealing to public opinion during the debate over health care back in 1994. So this is way before Obamacare. And in a counter ad produced by the Democratic National Committee, the argument was made that the opponents of the Clinton health care plan, that's Hillary Clinton, proposed a health care plan when her husband was president. That the Clinton opponents of this health care plan were using scare tactics. And you can see the tag end of the ad in this photo. Interest groups can be divided into 4 distinct types: economic, environmental, equality, and consumer or public interest groups. Economic policies can cause problems for business, labor, and farm interests. They fret over taxes, subsidies, and regulations. The interests of workers are represented by labor unions, and about 10 million Americans belong to labor unions, or about 12% of the workforce. This is really down from in 1956 when 33% of the workforce were in labor unions. In order to avoid the free rider problem, labor unions would like membership to be obligatory. You have to join a union. And this type of setup is called a closed shop, meaning if you work in that industry in a closed shop state, you have to join the union. That way, everyone, when the union, say, bargains with management for certain benefits, that people that aren't a member of the union don't get those benefits. That's how they get rid of the free rider problem. They try to make it so everyone has to join the union. However, some states, particularly in the South, forbid unions to require membership, and these are known as right-to-work states, and North Carolina is a right-to-work state. And as blue-collar manufacturing jobs have declined in the U.S., union power and membership have fallen, but some white-collar and public sector jobs have become unionized. Your airline pilots, for example, are unionized. In the Northeast, teachers are unionized. So that's kind of interesting. And it was interesting, in Wisconsin in 2012, there was a lot of debate about unions. And there were vigorous protests of union supporters. And this is shown here in the Wisconsin state legislature. The Wisconsin state legislature passed a law that took away collective bargaining rights from public sector employees. In other words, government, public employees, state employees, government employees, took away the ability for the unions to bargain collectively, like as a group, to act like a union. And after Governor Walker signed the bill into law, union activists mounted a campaign to recall the governor, which failed. In other words, to remove the governor from power. So there's a lot of fight between the idea of closed shop and right-to-work states. Economic interests. Business interests have the wealthiest and most powerful lobbying groups. They have the largest number of PACs and make the most contributions. And although we tend to assume that business interests will give more to Republicans because that party generally supports lower corporate taxes and fewer regulations, the truth is that PACs tend to give the most money to the party in power because they are paying for access to power. And business interests are not monolithic. Trucking and rail business, for example, would favor different policies. So it's like what benefits trucking might not benefit the railroads, so they may not be on the same side on some issues. So it's interesting. So if the Democrats are controlling Congress, then the Democrats get the bulk of the business interest group money. If Republicans are controlling Congress, then Republicans tend to get the most money. And this is a graph that shows the percentage of corporate PAC spending in each 2-year election cycle that went to Republican candidates for the House of Representatives. And so data for 2012 was not available when this was produced. This graph was produced. But if past patterns hold, the percentage should go up from 2010 because the Republicans are once again in the majority in the House during the 2012 campaign. Although a few environmental groups such as the Sierra Club have existed since the 19th century, most have sprung up since 1970. That's when the big explosion in environmental groups occurred. There are now more than 10,000 environmental groups with a combined revenue. Can you imagine more than 10,000 groups with a combined revenue of more than $2.9 billion? And environmental groups do not have the money of economic interest, but they have exerted influence in Congress because they have a lot of public support. Here's an example. This is the Save the Polar Bear interest group. A few interest groups use unconventional methods to get attention for their views and demands. The environmental activist group Greenpeace is really known for this. They come up with activities that really grab a lot of media attention. And here you see Greenpeace activists attracting media attention in an attempt to get the Secretary of the Interior, which is the part of the cabinet that deals with our national parks, trying to get the Secretary of the Interior to take regulatory action to combat global warming and help save the polar bear species. African Americans have been fighting against segregation and discrimination throughout American history, and one of the oldest groups pushing for civil rights is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, which argued and won Brown versus Board of Education, the school desegregation case in 1964. Recently, civil rights groups have been focusing on social welfare policies to help the poor. Women's rights groups have fought long and hard for equal rights for women. The National Organization for Women is one of the biggest groups, and they have lobbied to end discrimination on account of gender. One of their top goals has long been the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment, which states that the equality of rights under the law shall not be abridged on account of sex. However, the Equal Rights Amendment has been defeated. Consumer and public interest groups pursue policies that they believe will benefit everyone, not just members of the groups. And because they seek collective goods, they have a significant free rider problem and are not usually well funded. Despite this, they have won some legislative and legal victories in making consumer products safer. So, what exactly is the public interest? Each public interest group believes it knows what's in the public interest, but some religious groups believe they're acting in the public interest when they seek to impose their moral views on everyone. So, how do you decide what is just one group's belief and what is truly the public interest? I'll give you an example of something that was a public interest that got a collective good that was successful, and that was the lobby to make mandatory seatbelt laws. So that was pushed by several groups, and that is something as a collective good believed for everyone. So we have a bit of a conundrum about interest groups. A free society must allow for the representation of all groups that seek to influence political decision-making, yet groups are usually more concerned with their own self-interest than with the needs of society as a whole. For a democracy to work well, it's important that groups not be allowed to assume a dominant position. So do interest groups have a dominant position in the United States today? What do you think about that? James Madison believed that opposing interests would counteract each other. The theory of pluralism agrees with Madison. The fact that we have a large number of interest groups that are continually increasing in number and variety, and that their sheer numbers reduce the clout of any one interest, would seem to imply that Madison and the pluralists are right. But considering numbers alone masks the fact that a few big spending groups representing business interests dominate interest group politics. So does the money coming from these groups corrupt the democratic process? That's a big question. Hyperpluralists would argue that the formation of so many interest groups has led to policy gridlock, and it's increasingly difficult to initiate major policy change due to the variety of interests that must be appeased. And you hear this all the time in the election. You hear people saying that these special interests have bought Washington, everyone's corrupt, and that would fit into the hyperpluralist model. Americans are individualistic, but we also love to join interest groups. That isn't a contradiction because interest groups channel our political participation and facilitate the representation of individual interests. But all these interests want something from government, making it difficult to cut government spending, which is why we have this problem with the debt, and for one of the reasons. Every attempt to cut a program affects some interest group. There is also a vicious cycle created when government attempts to take responsibility for a new policy area due to interest group pressure, which encourages new groups to spring up around the issue. For example, once the government got actively involved in protecting the environment, many groups sprung up to lobby for strong standards and enforcement.